Hello everyone, and wishing you all a wonderful and peaceful day. Today we're going to discover how Trieu Duong secretly transformed an empty yard into a beautiful flower garden overnight for 7-month-old baby Truc Lam. But the sweetest moment is waiting ahead. How will little Truc Lam react when she sees the colorful flowers for the very first time? Stay with us until the end to experience this heartwarming countryside story filled with love, family, and simple happiness. And if you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey with Trieu Duong and baby Truc Lam. The afternoon sun slowly faded behind the hills while the small wooden house grew quiet for the first time that day. After a long morning of playing around the yard, little Truc Lam finally fell asleep in her hammock beside the window. The soft breeze moved the thin curtain gently, and the sound of birds outside mixed with her slow breathing. Trieu Duong stood nearby for a moment, carefully watching her peaceful face before quietly stepping outside. The yard still looked empty and rough after the rainy season. Patches of dry soil covered the ground, and only a few green plants survived near the fence. Trieu Duong looked around silently, as if imagining something completely different. He wanted to create a small flower garden where Truc Lam could play every morning when she woke up. He believed children should grow up close to nature, surrounded by colors and simple beauty instead of only dirt and unfinished land. Without wasting time, he picked up an old hoe resting beside the wall and walked toward the empty patch near the front gate. The afternoon heat was still strong, but he continued digging carefully into the hard soil. Every few minutes, he stopped to wipe sweat from his forehead before continuing again. Chickens wandered around the yard, curious about what he was doing, while the family dog followed him slowly from one corner to another. As the soil became softer, Trieu Duong began removing stones and dried roots from the ground. He wanted the flowers to grow properly, so he worked patiently with every small section of land. Nearby, several old buckets were filled with water collected from the morning rain. He carried them back and forth across the yard, pouring water over the dry earth until the ground slowly darkened and softened beneath his feet. After preparing the space, Trieu Duong walked to the side of the house where several young flower plants had been kept under a bamboo shelf. Some were small yellow daisies, while others had bright pink blossoms beginning to open. He had collected them over the past few weeks from neighbors and local markets because he already planned to build this little garden for Truc Lam one day. One by one, he carefully planted each flower into the soil. He adjusted the distance between them so the space would look colorful and balanced when everything fully bloomed. Occasionally, he stepped backward to look at the arrangement, quietly changing positions until he felt satisfied. Even though the work seemed simple, he treated every detail seriously because he imagined Truc Lam smiling when she saw the garden for the first time. Inside the house, Truc Lam continued sleeping peacefully, unaware of the surprise slowly taking shape outside. The sunlight became softer as the afternoon moved toward evening. Shadows from the banana trees stretched across the yard, while the cool wind finally arrived after the long, hot day. Trieu Duong continued working without rest, building a small curved border around the flower bed using leftover stones gathered near the riverbank. By sunset, the empty patch of land had completely changed. Bright flowers now covered the once dry soil, bringing life and color to the quiet yard. The simple stone border made the garden feel warm and welcoming, almost like a tiny park built especially for a child. Trieu Duong stood silently in front of it, breathing heavily after hours of work, but there was clear satisfaction in his eyes. Before going back inside, he filled a small watering can and gently watered every flower once more. Tiny drops of water sparkled under the orange evening light while the scent of wet soil slowly spread through the air. He hoped the flowers would grow strong quickly so Truc Lam could enjoy them every day. As darkness slowly covered the countryside, Trieu Duong quietly opened the wooden door and stepped back into the house. Truc Lam was still sleeping peacefully in her hammock, holding her small blanket tightly in her arms. He smiled softly after looking at her for a few seconds. Tomorrow morning, when she opened her eyes and walked outside, the entire yard would feel completely different. Early the next morning, soft sunlight slowly entered the wooden house through the thin bamboo walls. Outside, the sound of roosters echoed across the quiet countryside, while a cool breeze carried the fresh smell of wet soil from the yard. Trieu Duong had already been awake for a long time. He carefully prepared breakfast near the outdoor kitchen, trying not to make too much noise while baby Truc Lam was still sleeping inside. After several peaceful hours of rest, 7-month-old Truc Lam slowly woke up in her small hammock beside the window. She blinked sleepily while looking around the room, gently moving her tiny hands beneath the blanket. The morning light reflected softly on her round cheeks as she made small baby sounds, searching for Trieu Duong's familiar voice nearby. When he heard her awake, Trieu Duong quickly walked inside with a warm smile. He carefully lifted her into his arms before carrying her outside to enjoy the cool morning air. Truc Lam rested quietly against his shoulder at first, still sleepy from her nap, but everything changed the moment they stepped into the yard. Right in front of the house, the empty patch of dry land had completely transformed overnight. Bright yellow, pink, and white flowers now filled the small garden, gently moving in the morning wind. Tiny drops of dew sparkled across the petals under the sunlight, while butterflies floated slowly above the blossoms. Although Truc Lam was still only a baby, her eyes immediately widened with curiosity. She quietly stared at the colorful flowers while moving her little hands excitedly in the air. Soft baby laughter escaped from her mouth as she looked from one flower to another, completely fascinated by the bright colors surrounding her. Trieu Duong smiled happily after seeing her reaction. He slowly carried her closer to the garden so she could see everything more clearly. Truc Lam leaned forward in his arms, reaching her tiny fingers toward the flowers whenever the wind gently moved them closer. Every new color seemed to capture her attention for another few seconds before her eyes quickly moved somewhere else again. The peaceful yard suddenly felt much more alive than before. Birds landed near the bamboo fence, butterflies drifted across the garden, and even the family dog quietly walked beside them, as if curious about the new space too. Trieu Duong carefully walked around the flower bed while softly talking to Truc Lam, pointing at different flowers and watching her innocent reactions. After breakfast, he decided to continue improving the garden little by little. Near the mango tree beside the house, he began building a small bamboo sitting area where he could later sit with Truc Lam every afternoon. Since she was still too young to walk on her own, he wanted a peaceful place where she could safely play, rest, and enjoy nature as she grew older. Using old bamboo stored behind the house, Trieu Duong carefully cut and tied each piece together with thin rope. Throughout the entire morning, Truc Lam stayed nearby inside a small woven baby basket placed under the shade. From time to time, she watched him quietly while holding a tiny cloth toy in her hands. Whenever Trieu Duong looked back at her, she responded with soft baby sounds and small smiles that immediately made him laugh. Slowly, the simple bamboo bench began taking shape beside the flowers. Once finished, Trieu Duong placed a soft woven mat on top and carried Truc Lam over carefully. Sitting beside her in the peaceful garden, he gently helped her touch the flower petals for the first time. The baby immediately became fascinated by their softness, staring closely at her tiny fingers, brushing against the colorful blossoms. As the morning sunlight grew warmer, several neighbors walking past the road stopped briefly to admire the transformed yard. Many smiled warmly after seeing little Truc Lam sitting peacefully beside the flowers in Trieu Duong's arms. The once empty space now felt full of warmth, life, and happiness. Before the afternoon heat arrived, Trieu Duong slowly watered the flowers once again, while holding Truc Lam carefully against his chest. The fresh scent of wet soil spread through the air as butterflies continued dancing above the garden. Looking at the peaceful scene around him, he quietly hoped this small flower space would become part of Truc Lam's childhood memories as she slowly grew up surrounded by love, nature, and simple countryside happiness. After baby Truc Lam peacefully falls asleep, Trieu Duong quietly begins transforming the empty yard beside their wooden house into a beautiful flower garden. Under the hot afternoon sun, he spends hours digging the dry soil, planting colorful flowers, and building a small, peaceful space filled with nature and love. The next morning, 7-month-old Truc Lam wakes up and is carried outside by Trieu Duong, where she sees the colorful garden for the very first time. Her curious eyes and adorable reactions bring warmth and happiness to the quiet countryside home. Wanting to make the place even more special, Trieu Duong continues building a small bamboo sitting area beside the flowers so Truc Lam can safely enjoy the peaceful environment as she grows older. The simple garden soon becomes a heartwarming symbol of family love, childhood memories, and countryside happiness.